Adrienne Montani with First Call, BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. I hope on your screen you can see the beginning slide. So we're going to, just to give you a quick overview, we have an hour and I'm going to go through a lot of information. The intent of this is to give you an familiarize you with the report, what data is in it, and then its recommendations at the end. And at the end of each fact sheet or so, I'll stop and ask you if you have any clarifying questions. So for questions, if you can please use the question box and type in your question, because you're all on mute. Type in your questions, and then I'll try and respond verbally to those as I see them come in. We'll take some time, and then there'll be hopefully some time at the end as well for some just general questions. So I think when I stop for questions after each fact sheet, it would be more like clarifying questions if you don't understand the data being presented or that kind of thing. Please type those in then. But if you have kind of bigger questions about strategic, how are we going to use this, or that kind of, what are the key messages, what's been the government response, we can get to that at the end, I think. So I'll try and just get through the data. I'll let you know when something I'm referring to isn't in the report card, but just about everything we'll be going through is as actually in the report card and online. So appreciate your patience as I kind of go through things fairly quickly. And some of this will be familiar to you already, and some of it may be quite new to you. So the first thing I want to let you know is that, thank you, sorry. Okay, so how do I advance the slides? I did that, yeah, it's not working. Okay, there we go. So sorry, next slide. So this is, I wanted to just first of all give a shout out to our partners in producing this report card. It's a big job, and First Call couldn't do it without the help of a very helpful member of the coalition, Spark BC. They help with the maps and the data analysis and all kinds of things, so very much appreciative to Spark. And also we work collaboratively with Campaign 2000, the National Child Poverty End Child and Family Poverty Campaign. This is the group we do this in tandem with over the years. Everybody produces provincial report cards and a national report card, and we decide what data we can get from Stats Canada, that kind of thing. Also a shout out to the financial support from the Vancouver Foundation, from the United Way of the Lower Mainland, and some of our other union members in particular, Health Sciences Association, BCGEU, teachers, hospital employees union, and VanCity, and our host, VanCity Community Foundation. So are we really the caring society we think we are? And that's how we started the report card. We always have an introductory section, because really this report card is not just a research report, it's a call to action. We want people to use it year-round, and we know that the evidence in it and the stories in it illustrate that we have a child poverty crisis, we would call it, in BC, and that's why we make recommendations. So we're not just calling attention to it, but we want people to use it to move forward on the recommendations that we make. We know governments are making choices all the time about what they spend, what they collect, and the current choices, as we track the data, what the research tells us is that the current choices are increasing income inequality and therefore sustaining high poverty levels for children and families. So there's that call at the end for a more comprehensive poverty reduction plan for BC. It's been echoed widely by many others, including the Legislative Finance Committee and media, starting to ask, why are we so unwilling to move on this? So this tool that we hope you can use is meant to translate the concern that we know lies out there among British Columbians into the political will that we need to start moving on the political or the recommended solutions, policy solutions. So just again, a quick overview. There's lots of personal stories this time in the report that have been shared with us by parents and by youth aging out of foster care this year, to try and put that face. So sometimes we get into numbers debates with people, and we think it's powerful for people to hear how living in poverty is affecting families and their children, and those you can't deny their experience, kind of thing. So we try as much as we can to put those stories in there, and you can see some of the pictures up of some of the families who or individuals who shared their stories, as well as a photo that was taken by a former youth in care saying, "Ready or not, I'm coming for you," a little as her 19th birthday approached. There's also, and so we're trying also to illustrate the policy recommendations that we're making at the end of the report. There is a special website, and it's on the slide, still1in5.ca, where you can find the full report. You can jump straight to supporting the recommendations with a letter to the Premier. You can look at the maps, and we'll go through that a bit. There's many maps on the website that aren't in the report card, looking at geographical areas. You can, eventually, we haven't got this posted yet, but you can watch the speeches from the launch of the news conference that we had. It'll be on our YouTube channel. And there's a link to a powerful spoken word poem by former Youth in Care Meredith Graham on the site as well. So, and the slides from this webinar will also be posted up there, so you can share that or return to them if you want to use them in your own. And we're happy to share any of these slides if you want to use them in your own slideshow, if you were preparing some kind of public education or wanting to incorporate this information into something. So we hope that you'll circulate the links that are on the website. There'll be some social media rolling out soon too on there, to your networks, to write to your own MLAs as well as to the Premier in support of the recommendations in the report. So let's get into the numbers. Fact sheet 1. So we start with that 1 in 5 children are poor in BC. And that's, so it's 19.8% exactly, but it's rounds up to 1 in 5 still as the ratio. It is higher than the national average, as this graph shows you. So the middle bars there showing 163,260 children, and you can see the number, how it compares to the Canadian rate. It also, you can see in this graph the under 6 rate that is of interest to those of you working in the early childhood field. So you can see that the under 6 child poverty rate is a bit higher than the overall children's rate. And then what's also alarming to those of us who are children's advocates is that the overall rate, let alone the under 6 rate, is higher than the overall poverty rate. So when you take the whole population, including children, it's only 16%. Only, it's not exactly a small number, but it's 16% for British Columbia, and ours is, and so the children's rate is higher than the overall population. So what that does is of course point to the need for systemic policy changes that better support families in their child rearing years. So just to get a look at what that, to try and give people an image, this is one of the shareables we'll be putting on the website. It's in the report as well. Poor Child City was something that we came up this year to imagine a city composed only of BC's poor children, which would have these 163,000 some odd residents. It would be the 5th largest city in BC. In 2014, when these stats come from, and that's bigger than Abbotsford. So just that kind of gives you some sense of the scope. And so just to cover where we get our numbers, because often that's the first thing people want to feel if they're using these numbers and the poverty rates and stuff that we're putting out in here, they want to make sure they know what it's related to. So there is an appendix in the back of the report that shows a little chart like this that has the low income measures, or the LIM after tax, and you can see then the poverty lines using this measure for different family sizes. And you can actually calculate this up to larger families, but what we've just shown here is up to families of 4 or 8 by the time you have 4 adults and 4 children. So the LIM is a measure of the median income of families across the country, and then 50% below that is the poverty line for these different family types. So that's the measure we're using. There are other measures that Stats Canada puts out, like the market basket measure, and they put out still the LICO, the low income cutoff, which First Call used to use but no longer does because it has not been updated since 1992, other than by inflation. But the actual way it measures relative poverty is extremely out of date, given the changes in expenses for things like housing and food and childcare and things over the years that have not been incorporated into that measure. So we don't use that anymore, and we use the LIM. The other reason we use the LIM, we actually like the market basket measure, but we use the LIM because that's the measure we're using, but we have to then match it against a data set. And the data set we've been using for the last 2 years is tax filer data, which comes directly from people's tax returns, and some administrative data also around when people apply for child benefits, that kind of thing. So in our opinion, the tax filer data is much more robust than the kind of survey data. There's a Canadian income survey that's a survey of a certain number of individuals or families across the province. This is much more comprehensive and robust, and including the fact that it includes on-reserve families who file taxes, which still is probably an undercount because a lot of families on reserve don't file taxes, but as that changes with child benefits and things, we are capturing a greater number. So we're very confident in the database we're using and in the data that it's producing for us. So when, again, we look at where we rank, I believe last year we were second and only Manitoba was worse than us. We are now fifth worst, or the fifth highest poverty rate of all provinces. And again, we think some of this is partly because our number hasn't changed. We're still 1 in 5 kids, but some of the other provinces, like the prairie provinces that have proportionally larger Aboriginal or Indigenous populations, may be seeing a better capture of their data showing up. And similarly, for some of the smaller provinces, they're also starting to see data where on the old measures they couldn't sometimes get any data at all because the sample size was too small. So now we're able to do that. So, and if we added the territories in, the Yukon would be lower than BC, the Northwest Territories and Nunavut would be higher. So we're sort of in the middle of the pack these days. Also in fact sheet 1, there's a graph because we know in that overall 1 in 5 number, there are a number of overrepresented groups that we want to shine a light on and make sure people understand that what's underneath the 1 in 5. So we know that children in lone parent families, we'll get into that in another fact sheet, new immigrants, Indigenous children, racialized children, and children affected by disabilities, either their own or their parent, are all groups that are overrepresented in poverty stats, child poverty stats. And this data is we don't have the new long-form census data yet, that finally was reinstated, but using the National Household Survey data, we've shown just Surrey here, but you can see the overrepresentation in Surrey and Metro Vancouver of Aboriginal children compared to all children. So it's just an enormous gap there that is clear, and when we have all the data from the other groups as well, we'll be able to show that again clearly. So that's definitely something we want to always keep in mind when we're looking at what are the recommendations. Then we have to make sure that any poverty reduction plan or any measures we take specifically address these overrepresentations and bring these children out of poverty. So in fact sheet 2, we have the overtime, a look at child poverty over time and how we've landed in 2014, which is the latest data we have at still 1 in 5. So one of the things we always go back to and look at is when the House of Commons promised to end child poverty in Canada by the year 2000. That's where Campaign 2000 comes from. We always look at the number back then, and it was 15.5% in BC back then. So 25 or so years later, we're at a higher rate. So this is not a trend we want to see, and it shows a lack of progress. And if you look at using the tax filer data and the data we could afford to purchase from Stats Canada, we only go back to 2000. But looking at the last 14 years, this graph in fact sheet 2 shows the rate of slight decline for British Columbia and for Canada over that 14-year period. So we went from back in 2000 having 1 in 4 children poor in BC to 1 in 5. So a slight decrease, but both of these are very high numbers, and this is very slow movement over 14 years in our opinion, because there have been budget surpluses during this time. There's no reason why we haven't made better progress in our opinion. The change from just the last year, 2013 to 2014, that last year of measure, was a decrease of 0.6%, or 4,550 children. So at this pace, when we looked at an average, how between 2000 and 2014, what's the average numbers of children being lifted out of poverty each year? It's around just over 4,000. It would take us at this pace till 2053, the year 2053, to eliminate child poverty in BC, and that's just way too slow. And the other thing this graph shows us is that we've been consistently higher than the Canadian average over that 14-year period. So I'm going to pause just a second if anybody has any questions on those first two fact sheets. Let's see if anybody types in any questions. Don't think I see any yet. Okay, so I'm going to carry on. You can always ask questions later. So in fact sheet, sorry, just a second, having a little technical difficulty. I couldn't get it to move. All right, there we go. Okay, so in fact sheet 3, we start to dig down. One of the most overrepresented groups in child poverty stats are children in lone parent families. They only make up just about 20% of the population of children. Lone parent families make up about 20% of the families with children. But the poor children make up, in lone parent families, make up almost half of the poor kids. So that's gives you an idea that when you look at this next graph, what we're seeing is a 50% child poverty rate for children in lone parent families. So 1 in every 2 BC children of single parents were poor in 2014. And that's a staggering number. It hasn't changed. When we look at that 0.6% drop between 2013 and 2014, it showed up in the same figure in the 2-parent families. So they went from 13% to 12.4%. So that's where we can see, again, a 0.6% drop in child poverty in that year. But there was no drop at all in lone parent rate. It's 50.3%, so a good half, or 1 in 2. When we look over time here, from 2000 to 2014, it's a 4% decrease, because it's been way over 50% for a number of years. It was going up, then it dropped a little bit around 2006. But that's overall, it's a 4% in those 14 years, a 4% decrease for lone parent families. And when we compare ourselves to other provinces, we had the 3rd smallest decrease of all 10 provinces. Because if we look to some other ones like that have poverty reduction plans, I should say, like Newfoundland, they dropped their lone parent poverty rate by 20%. And both Nova Scotia and Quebec dropped theirs by 16%. So we know from looking at other provinces that this is certainly not inevitable. We could be doing much better by lone parents. If you're interested in the numbers, they're in the report. Children in lone parent families, poor children make up, it's 80,720 poor children, and 2 parents, it's 82,540 children. And of course, when we're looking at lone parents, we know that gender matters. It makes a huge difference. 83% of lone parent families in 2014 were female-led. And so there's a reason. What we're seeing is the reflection of systemic issues like unaffordable childcare, unavailable childcare, so that single parents who are women and men, but can't find work, and that also women make less than men. When we look at the median income of lone mothers and lone fathers, as this graphic shows, the lone mothers make about 65% of what lone fathers make. So just even in that half of that population, 1/5 of the families, you can see the gender wage gap represented there. Women make up the majority of minimum wage workers. They generally make lower wages than men overall, as we can see here, and they also have more part-time work. And often that's not by choice, and sometimes related to family responsibilities, and other times just to what they can find in the workplace. So, mindful of the gender issues behind the lone parent poverty, extremely high lone parent poverty rate. When we get to fact sheet 4, you can see a kind of busy graph here that I think I can unpack for you, because actually most poor families with children in BC live quite a bit far below the poverty line. So this is an illustration of how far below the poverty line the median total after-tax family incomes were for 4 different family types. You can see by lone parent with 1 child, 2 child, and couples with 1 or 2 children. So what if we take something like overall, the gap, which is the darker part of the bar, the poverty gap between what people's annual incomes are and the poverty line, is over $10,000 for every family type. And for some, as a couple with 2 children, it's getting up to close to $12,000, $11,961. So that family has an income, that couple with 1 child there in the second bar has an income, an annual income, which includes all kinds of, tax benefits, everything. This is their after-tax income, about $18,000 a year, which is almost $12,000 below the $30,000 poverty line for a family with 2 parents and 1 child. So that's how the graph works, and you can see the huge gaps for each of those families. And like a lone parent with 1 child would be 10,000 or more below the poverty line, etc. And just a quick aside to the impacts, which probably most of you on the phone are aware of, but the impacts of the depth of poverty mean that people are, 2 basics, food and shelter, are insecure. There's a very high number of people in core housing need, and food insecurity is big in these for these families. So for single parent families, it's actually the parent, and so we could say again, it's probably mostly mothers who restrict their own food, and we hear this, and there's one of the stories in the report card this year refers to that, Marta's story. She talks about her child was always well fed, but she went without when her budget wouldn't stretch over the month. And then we know that this is 2016 figure that 33,000 children went to the food bank, that children make up in this year, and that children make up 32% of BC's food bank users, which is pretty awful and says something about our society. When we get to fact sheet 5, we want to emphasize and help people understand there's a myth that all poor children are on income assistance. That's often where the public mind goes, and we want people to know that most poor children live with parents in the paid workforce, whether full-time full year or part-time part year or part-time full year, and again, often not by choice. There are other constraints on working sometimes, especially for single parent families. So one of the things we look at when we track child poverty in families with parents in the workforce is what are wages like, because that's the major source of income. And we know that the minimum wage back in 2014 was $10.25, definitely not enough at that time to raise a family out of poverty. As you can see from the graphic there, if a single parent working full-time full year at that wage would have earned only $18,655 and would have been about $9,500 below the poverty line. So working full-time, so that's when we start to ask, this person's working full-time, this parent's working full-time, what do you want them to do? And taking on extra jobs, multiple jobs, is what a lot of parents do, which gives them time poverty and not enough time to be with their children. If 2 parents with 2 children were both working full-time at the 2014 minimum wage, full year, full-time, they would have earned about $37,000, and they would have been $3,000 below the poverty line for that family type, so even with 2 income earners. And we know so that indexing, governments agreed to index the minimum wage year to year, but that's not enough because the consumer price index doesn't give it enough of a boost, and so for very low wage earners, an annual indexing isn't enough for them to catch up. In this report, we're calling for $15 an hour minimum wage as soon as possible. That would start moving things up towards a living wage. And then we've looked, as you can see in the slide there, even with the 60-cent increase that's been added to BC's minimum wage since 2014, it still won't lift a family out of poverty. It's still, so we're trying to get it up to 2015 and to $15 an hour. And the other thing is we want living wages. First Call hosts a Living Wage for Families campaign. And so also in fact sheet 5 you'll see this graph, which shows you just for a number of communities what the living wage was calculated for in each of these regions, and then how many families in those regions we chose a couple families with children because the calculation of the living wage is based on couple families with children. You can see how many quite significant percentages of families in a number of these areas, anywhere from 22 to 34%, were not making a living wage. So it's always, that's why that campaign is so important. And another way to look at that, also in Fact Sheet 5, is this graphic that shows that when we analyzed over a 7-year period from 2007 to 2014, the median family income in these, well, this was in Metro Vancouver actually, went up 10%. So there was over those 7 years, but the basic cost for that family went up 18%. So they're still way behind. They're losing ground. And some of the things that drove that up to 18%, when you start pulling out individual things, rent and childcare, as you can see in the graphic, went up enormously in that 7 years. So rent went up 26% and childcare went up 35%. So wages are definitely not, and family incomes are definitely not keeping up with the costs. So again, I'm going to pause here for a second and see if, just pause for questions, see if anybody's typed in any questions at this point. Or give you time to type in some questions. Yeah, no. Okay, well, I'm going to go back to proceeding with the presentation. Seeing no questions at this point. I have to do something. Okay, here we go. Oops. Back. Okay, so Fact Sheet 6 is families with children on welfare. And so I mentioned they weren't the majority of children. Most and some families who work go on welfare and then go off. So families on income assistance are often on and off. But children on poor children or children on welfare make up a minority, only about 20% of the poor kids in the province on average in any year. But they are in some of the deepest poverty because our welfare rates are so low and have not been raised since 2007, other than the disability rate increase recently that then got taken away in a bus pass, and some of you may be familiar with that whole fiasco, in my opinion, to give and then take away, so that families on disability came out very little ahead. But when we look at families with children here, what we're measuring in this, again, busy graph is the difference over time between 1989 and 2014, and what their welfare incomes, and that would include all their child benefits and any tax benefits, carbon tax rebates, etc., that they might qualify for, what their total incomes, and that's the blue part of the bar, sorry, the entire bar is their total income, is so you can see for that it's actually gone down since 1989. They've actually lost buying power, and that the shift is in federal benefits going up, and I think when we start to see the impact of the enhanced federal new child tax benefit, we'll see an even greater expansion of the gray part of the box there, the federal contribution to welfare incomes, and because families on income assistance are allowed to keep the full child benefit, thank goodness, and the blue part will continue to shrink as a proportion because the province has not been, they're letting the federal government basically carry the load, and by not raising income assistance rates. So these families are significantly, like the gap for a lone parent with one child on income assistance is $7,000 or $8,000 below the poverty line. They lost $581 in actual buying power over those 9 years, and a two-parent family is about $14,000 below the poverty line and lost over $1,400 in buying power. And the other thing to remember is that most of these families on income assistance are lone parent families, mostly led by women, and about 68% of those lone parents on income assistance are on disability assistance, and therefore they had a medical condition or something, or had persistent multiple barriers, or they're on disability assistance due to a long-term disability. So these are people who are not able to work, and yet we're somehow, the way our welfare system is structured so punitively, it's as if they will just make it so uncomfortable that they'll just all have to try and go get a job, and that's just not feasible for some of them. So our social safety net needs rejigging in both its philosophy and its benefits. In the report card, you'll see a story, and on the website, from Neil and Jake. They were in last year's report card as well, Neil and his son Jake, because they were part of a victory when we got the child support. Neil has a disability. He's on disability assistance, and he's also a widower, and so his child support from his CPP pension was being clawed back, and government stopped doing that in 2015. But the other part, the larger part of his CPP pension, is still being clawed back. That's the spousal benefit, or the survivor benefit, and that would make a huge difference to Neil and Jake if they would allow him to. So he's still fighting, and I believe has just launched a human rights complaint that this is a discrimination against people with disabilities to take away their pensions. There was one other clawback I'll just mention. We noted in the report card that was recently changed. That's very good. So the clawback, or eliminated, the clawback of parental and maternity benefits, EI benefits, when one parent is on disability, usually when one parent can work and earn a bit during the year, and when they go on mat leave or parental leave and get EI benefits, that's been clawed back off of the disability check for their partner, and that's stopped as of October 1st of this year. We're very happy, very grateful to the families that came forward to share their stories on that, and so that'll make a big difference, and I believe BC may be the first province to do that. So that's something we're really happy. There was a human rights complaint pending on that didn't have to go ahead because they made that change. So new in this year's report card is Fact Sheet 7, where we wanted to highlight in support of the Fostering Change campaign this year that the Vancouver Foundation has been leading, and other groups. We wanted to highlight that we're creating poverty by not giving youth aging out of government care the support they need. So there are several stories, as well as images. We use some youth photography, and as I think I mentioned earlier, there's a spoken word poem, very powerful one. I urge you to go to the Still 1 in 5 website, and you can read it in full. The text is there, or you can listen to, there's a link to a YouTube version of it where you can listen to Meredith, the author of the poem, speak it, I guess, it's spoken word. So this is a huge issue, that most youth in care, the majority of them, the 60%, are Indigenous, and these young people are aging out of care at age 19 without the kind of family supports and other supports that youth not in care usually can rely on. And we know that more and more the trend is for young people into their 20s, long into their 20s, to either stay at home or to bounce back and forth as they try and make their way into adulthood and handle very high living costs these days and low wages for that age group, or handle the costs of getting a post-secondary education. So we wanted to really highlight that. A couple of facts to pull out from this fact sheet is that almost half of youth end up on income assistance within a few months of their 19th birthday and aging out of care. And that really plunges them into not only deep poverty, but often isolation. Again, noting that they may not have the family connections and supports that would be there for children not aging out of care with family supports. And also another fact that 40% of BC's youth, homeless youth, have reported that they have been in government care at some point. So there are recommendations related to this in the fact sheet, but basically it's overall it's that in the recommendation section that we want extended support up to the age of 25 at least for these kids, not just little bits of programs here and there, but much more enhanced, solid financial support, relationship support with an adult that you can always go back to, get references from, those kinds of things. So we're hoping to see some more movement from government on that. In fact sheet 8, we highlight, as we have done for a couple of years now, the variation again within those overall 1 in 5 numbers. So how does that play out across regions, across different parts of the province? We know that 22 out of 29 regional districts in BC had at least 1,000 children living in poverty in them, and yet we know it's not evenly distributed. So we have maps again and most of these maps live on the Still 1 in 5 website. This one is reproduced in the report card. It's the only one this year, and the rest just you go to the website because they're much easier to see. You can blow them up easily by clicking on them on the Still 1 in 5 website. This first one, when we looked at regional districts, and again, thanks to Spark BC for helping us with make these maps available. You can see the dark areas are where the poverty rate is over 40% for children, and so there are some like Central Coast. If you can see that on the map there, right in the West Coast, Central Coast, it's over 50% there for children in that regional district. And there's an interesting divide around the province, with the easternmost part of the province having lower poverty rates than the westernmost and some of the northern areas. So, and this map also shows if it decreased over the last year or went up, decreased. Most regional districts did go down nominally a little bit, like less than a percentage point or 1 percentage point or so. A few went up, about 2 of them went up, and that was Central Coast and Mount Waddington, I think. Another map that you'll find on the website is this one. It's looking at, because the majority, I think 85% of poor children live in urban areas. So these are all the urban areas that the census data we can get that shows the poverty rate in all the urban areas around the province and the number of poor children in those areas. So you can see that on that map. When you look at it, that you'll see Duncan, Port Alberni, Prince Rupert had the highest rates. They were at 1 in 3 children poor. And so we hope that this is useful for those of you who are not Lower Mainland based and around the province to be able to use this in your own advocacy to reduce child poverty in your local community. Here's the map also that's on the website for the Lower Mainland Metro Vancouver area. And that one we broke down, are able to break it down by census tract, so people can see their actual neighborhoods. And there's about 8 other maps on there that break this out into, so you can see Burnaby or Richmond or Langley or the other municipalities separately to see, because about 51% of BC's poor children do live in the Metro Vancouver area. So it's a fairly high number of kids. And also on that webpage there are some charts, so that those in the metro area who are interested in how their city ranks with other Metro Vancouver cities, you can see a chart that ranks them by the number of children. Surrey has the biggest number of poor children by a large measure, but the rate of child poverty is also ranked there, and you can see that. Surrey's not the highest for the ranking. So those are if you scroll down on that map page, you can see those there. So in fact sheet 9, we get to income inequality for families, because we know we want to look at the root causes. So a lot of the recommendations we make in the report card, some of them only address the symptoms, some of them we think would address the root causes, but we really need to pay attention to the growth in income inequality. The data, this is new data, we finally got some new data for 2014 of the breakdown or the share of the pie for its economic families. So I just want to point that out. This is not just families with children. So what's reflected in this data is the inequality between all families in BC. So it excludes single people, but it also includes childless couples. So that's just something to remember, because I think if we weren't able to get the data for just families with children yet, but if we saw that, we think there would probably be a more dramatic difference, just based on previous years when we've been able to get it. But it's not unsimilar to what we've gotten in the past, that the richest 10% of families are taking home over a quarter of the pie. The bottom 50% of families are sharing only a quarter of the pie. So we're very concerned about this trend, of course. Again, this is income that includes all kinds. This is after-tax income, so it includes all of the different benefits that might come through government transfers as well as earned income. What it doesn't include is wealth. So you probably would see even a more dramatic picture. Right now, it's 75% of all the income is held or earned by the top half of the top 5 deciles, and I think that would be even more dramatic if we had wealth included, because this doesn't include things like house costs and inherited wealth and that kind of thing. But we do have a chart in that fact sheet where you can see the actual average incomes in each of the 10 deciles. So you can kind of see, you can see this over time. So you can see that in 2014, the gap was between, on average, the poorest 10% earning $21,400 a year, which I should add is the lowest poorest decile of any province, and the top decile making on average $271,000 a year. You can see the gain in the last column. You can see, well, you can see the annual gain in dollars, and then you can see the rate of growth. So the bottom, the poorest 10% got an 8% boost in what was basically 25 years, and the richest 10% got a 49% boost or growth in their income over that time. So that's as we look at these each year, it's the gap is continuing to grow. We have the biggest gap in BC between the top and the bottom. So we have a 13-to-1 ratio between the top 10% and the bottom 10%. So knowing all of that, we know that government makes a huge government can make a huge difference, that policy matters. So we've calculated again how many children were lifted out of poverty in 2014 thanks to things like child benefits and other kinds of tax credits. It was almost 61,000 children. That's not insignificant. And so we know we could do more, however. The child poverty rate without those kinds of transfers would be 27% in BC in 2014. It came down to 19.8 after those kinds of government transfers. So that's a 28% reduction, and that actually is quite a lot of kids. Oh, sorry, 27%, because here's the graph. So again, we start to compare ourselves to other provinces, looking to who can we learn from to do better. We dropped ours from down by 27% from the market poverty rate that would have been there without any government transfers. You can see Quebec, PEI, Ontario, Newfoundland, basically 6 provinces did much better than us. The overall average in Canada was 35% drop. So there's many things we could be doing. If you are interested in sort of what does government help that we're talking about look like and what could we do more of, we described that on, I think it's page 35 of the report. But certainly we know that things like Newfoundland in their poverty reduction plan raised their benefits for welfare benefits for lone parents up to the poverty line, or maybe even a little bit over it. So that took one very vulnerable part of the population right out of poverty. So that's the kind of thing we could be looking at. The other kind of thing we could be looking at, this chart is not in the report card. I'm happy to send the slide or use it, take it off the website when it's posted. But we did look at, because there's a new Canada Child Benefit, we expect it to show quite a bit of difference when it starts to show up in the statistics in 2016. And in 2015, there was a new early childhood tax benefit in British Columbia. So we compared our provincial child benefit to those in other provinces. You can see us compared to 7 other provinces here, and that all of the other provinces that have child benefits, it's a 0 to 18 benefit, and ours is only an early childhood 0 to 6 benefit. So that we calculated the lifetime investment if a family were to qualify for the maximum benefit over the life of the child. We're being quite miserly in the investment in the life of each child compared to other provinces. We also looked just at the amount. So ours is $660 at maximum per year, and in Quebec, it's like 4 times that. So that's something we're in the report card this year. We have a recommendation in last year to enhance that benefit. Good that it started, but it really could be enhanced to mimic other provinces. So now we get to recommendations. I'm rushing a little bit through here, and so I want to leave some time, if we can, at the end for questions also. So if you're starting to think of some questions, please feel free to start typing them in. I'm going to just step quickly through the recommendations in the back of the report card. The overarching one is we need a plan with some targets and timelines. We've offered some up here that we'd like to see the child poverty rate drop by 7% or lower by 2020, and we want this in legislation so that we can hold ourselves accountable. And then there's basically 20 other recommendations. Some I've referenced as we've gone through the fact sheets. We want the minimum wage up. We want it to apply to all workers because some are excluded from it, and we want it indexed annually. once it gets up to $15 an hour. We want to see public sector, we want living wages from all public sector employers, since these are recommendations to government in this report that affect all direct and for government contracted employees, which is where you'll find low wage contracted employees still, especially in the healthcare sector and some other ones that are basically on the government payroll but contracted out to other employers who then pay low wages. Number 3, we've mentioned that disability and income assistance rates are way below, so we want to see those increased. We want to see post-secondary program options in that single parent employment initiative that came in to help try and get lone parents off income assistance or help them remove some barriers. Good program. It's just still very restrictive on what you can only take a program that's 12 months and we'd like to see actually all people on income assistance have that kind of access to be able to go to post-secondary. And right now, because student grants are so few and far between and not generous enough to really support a family, if they were to go up, just go on, and they'd have to go on student loan if they were to leave income assistance. We want to see that changed. We want to redesign, as I've just mentioned, the early childhood tax benefit. We want the Canada Child Tax Benefit to hit a certain target, 50% reduction in child poverty in Canada by 5 years, and it's not going to be indexed for 4 years. That's a flaw. We want to see huge increases in responding to the human rights decisions and others around First Nations child welfare, education, and health services. We want to see investments there because, again, we've seen that this Indigenous children and families are way overrepresented in these stats, and it's time to change that. One of the solutions we know is the $10 a day child care plan. We want to see enhanced parental and maternity leave. Many families, low-income families, can't afford even to take what's offered because their wages are so low they can't afford to stay out of work very long. So we want to see some major increases to that, both to the eligibility, so it includes more parents, and the generosity of the benefits. Again, we can look to Quebec where they're doing a much better job. We want to ensure, as I've mentioned, that all youth aging out of care have the supports they need, at least up until age 25. We want to see housing supports specifically targeted to queer and transgendered youth because, again, what we're seeing is the number that they are much greater risk of homelessness and social exclusion due to loss of family support. We have this long-standing one that we've been working on for grandparents raising their grandchildren, that when they turn 65, they lose the children's benefit when they're on CPP disability, and they're forced to go on CPP disability often before they're even ready to. So there's some issues there that, again, we're disadvantaging a very vulnerable population, doing a stellar job raising their grandchildren. Immigrants and refugees, there's lots of things around enhanced employment and better settlement supports and protections when they're in the workforce because they're highly exploited, often when they're new in the workforce. So we want to see some changes there. The transportation loan was waived. The federal transportation loan was waived for Syrian refugees, but wasn't applied to all refugees. We've been calling for that to be eliminated for years. So there's a wedge in the door, but it's still unfair because it was only for a particular group of Syrian refugees coming in. And we want to see post-secondary debt lowered and barriers removed. I think in the long run, we'd like to see free post-secondary education. We're working our way towards that with the Federation of Students. And lastly, on the last screen here, the education guarantee. Again, this is a barrier that was raised up again that makes it hard for low-income families who need further post-secondary in order to get good-paying jobs. We want that tuition-free adult basic education reinstated, what used to be called the education guarantee. Employment insurance has been shrinking and limiting eligibility. Lots to do to make that a more robust benefit again, as it used to be in decades past. I want to see housing's in crisis, especially in the Lower Mainland, but around the province. So lots of social housing deficits there and affordable rental housing. Lots of work to do in that regard. Universal coverage for other health aspects of healthcare, like prescription drugs, dental and eye care, should be instituted, and that we're looking particularly to Canada for that, the federal government. And we think tax reform needs to happen at both the federal and provincial level to make it fair, because we've seen regressive taxation instead of progressive taxation has been the trend over time, as higher income people are paying less of their income in tax when you look at all of the fees like MSP and those kinds of things. So we want to reduce income inequality through the tax system. So that's the end of the slides. How many minutes do I have left? 9 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to put up the screen for questions and just see if there are any being typed in. Oh, there's one here, right? But I can't quite read. Oh, it says, never mind, you just answered it. Okay, there was one. Do we know the richest 10% of families' average income? Okay, that one got answered. All right. Ontario model. Can't read the beginning of that one. Are you looking at the wages and benefits experiment they've established in Ontario, modeled on the test in some Scandinavian countries? I think that is if that's referring, I think to they're starting a pilot on basic income. I don't know if that's what that's referring to. Maybe the person could type in. So I know there is a basic income recommendation, but I don't think it's started yet. So maybe this is referring to something else. Wages and benefit experiment. I'm not sure if that's referring to the basic income experiment that I know Hugh Siegel has been tasked with putting out a report on and making a recommendation on, and they're going to do a pilot project. But I don't have any more information than that. So, but it is something we want to watch for sure. Lots of debate in the community, anti-poverty community these days around basic income and its pros and cons. There's some great material out by CCPA, put out a discussion paper, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, that had lots of different opinions in it, so recommend that reading. I don't know if we have another question above there. No? Okay. All right. There we can see better. Okay. Not really a question. I just want to thank you for doing this webinar. It's very helpful to be able to translate the information in the report to our communities. Great. Thank you for that. I hope it's helpful. And we also just want to remind you that anything you have a question about as you're using this, or sometimes we have actually more data than we can put into the report card. So if you have questions, please feel free to give us a call, and either ourselves or Spark. Sometimes Spark has even more detailed data on that we don't publish on census tracts around the province or postal codes around the province, that kind of thing. If that kind of really localized data is helpful to you, let us know. We can pull it out, because we want this to be useful all the way around the province. Okay, I don't see any more questions or comments. So I'll just wait a little bit more, but I want to thank you all for joining us today, those of you who've been on the line or on the web, and hope you can. We really hope you will use this. We're going to be rolling out some shareables, social media kinds of shareables shortly on the Still 1 in 5 website. Of course, you'll see them in our Twitter feed and on our Facebook page and out in the weekly newsletter and that kind of thing as well. But so we really hope that you will use those in your own social media feeds. We want to keep this issue. We don't like it to be just a one-time thing on November 24th or the week after, but really keep the pressure up the year round, and so that especially we're in a pre-election period, so we hope that all of these materials get used to educate the public, voters generally, whether it's in all candidates meetings or direct conversations with potential candidates, incumbents seeking re-election. We really want this to be used and one of the things the media asked when we were doing some media work after this was published was things like, what's government response, and how come we're still at this, and how come that we haven't changed this yet? And that's a question we should be asking people who've been in government a while and those who aspire to form government, is what they're planning to do on this issue and how to make it, both to see the reflection of the proposals or the recommendations that we've made in their party platforms, as well as just making this an issue as something that they want, that they're promising, making commitments on. I guess we will be putting out an election toolkit from First Call as well as we get responses from parties, but we can just look in the media and see already that, we know that the New Democratic Party has put in or tried to move a poverty reduction plan legislation, or introduced it into the legislature several years in a row without any success yet. So we know where they stand we think, on that, because they've tried to introduce that bill. We also have announcements from the NDP on the $15 moving to, I don't know the timeline, but I believe that they said they would move on the $15 an hour minimum wage, and they've said they support implementing the $10 a day child care plan. So we now need to hear from other parties and where they stand on those things. We haven't seen their platforms yet or other parts of it, though we do have sometimes a response regularly. We have a response from government to the report card in the form of a sometimes we get a letter back, or usually we get a letter back from the Minister for Children and Family Development, but this time, so we haven't got that yet. It usually comes a little later. But we do have a fact sheet to that Minister Kedia published that is very much like previous years, with listing all the things that the government thinks are reducing poverty, some of which we would challenge, because being a low tax regime doesn't necessarily take people out of poverty, because low income people don't pay a lot of tax. So we'll be monitoring that and putting that out also in all of First Coast publications, and with the election toolkit, with other questions that can be asked, not just around poverty. So I just wanted to mention that. But certainly we look forward to meeting you on social media, and we'll retweet your retweets, and we'll see if we can keep this alive for those who use social media, and then trying to get it into local papers. I know the coverage of this report was pretty good in a number of local papers, and if you write op-eds or you write letters to the editor and take this information to your elected representatives, we can, I think, make a difference. We're a big coalition. So thank you again to all of you. I think we're out of time, so we'll see you in other ways. Thanks very much and again, just don't hesitate to send us an email if you have a question. Thanks very much.